Amplifier, an undeniable climate emergency podcast.
This episode, we are so pleased to talk with educator and the co-founder of Movement Generation, Justice and Ecology Project, Gopal Dayaneni. Gopal has always been a part of movement building through his work with many organizations, including the Climate Justice Alliance, Indian Collective, and the People's Solar Energy Fund. Today we talk about social, racial, environmental, and economic justice and how the violence of colonialism impacts vulnerable communities. We also talk about the ongoing genocide in Gaza, why it is central to the struggle for climate justice, and how it is just one more piece of the colonial machine.
Welcome. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you. When we had our pre-conversation, I felt like I didn't want it to end. And so I've been just eager to get back into it. We've got a bunch of things from ecofascism and fascism to Gaza and Palestine on the plate. So lots to dig in with. But why don't we, I usually like to start, let people kind of talk about, your work and how you arrived at it, just to get some context before we kind of dive in to the meat of the topic. So just love to hear a little bit about how you kind of found your way in the area of work that you do and kind of how you define the work that you do.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk about what's going on in the world. I mean, that's sort of my role, or one of the roles I play. How did I get into this work? I've been an organizer, activist working on environmental, ecological, social justice issues for quite some time. I didn't start that way. I really started being very focused on racial justice, particularly as like a student activist. In many ways, Palestine and the Intifada, the first Intifada, was very much a part of my political consciousness. And then, of course, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War happened. And that's when I started to realize that there was this inextricable relationship between militarism and resource extraction. Just to put a little quick story on it, like when I was a college student and the Iraq War started in 1991, I was at a rally. I was going to be one of the student speakers, and someone who was going before me, an environmentalist, had everybody chanting "No blood for oil," which made a lot of sense to me. But I also felt a little bit like there was something missing, and I realized that what we really should be chanting is no blood or oil, because where there's oil, there has to be bloodshed. There's no other way to get it. And that led me on a journey of like trying to interrogate the relationship in many ways between resource extraction and the assault on the living world, and the assault on human communities as part of the living world. So that's sort of how I got into it. But the other way to answer the question is, I'm actually a preschool teacher in real life, and working with young kids was also a very politicizing experience, and started to realize that, working with children and families forced into homelessness, globalization really does matter. Like the WTO really does matter. Neoliberalism really does matter. And you're watching it play out every day in the lives of these young people when you're trying to, putty the gaps of systemic failures. That'll radicalize you too. So anyway, that's how I got into it.
Yeah.
And I co-founded an organization called Movement Generation, Justice and Ecology Project with a group of other just incredible, wonderful people. And we're a collective, a flat democratic organization. So I was part of the staff collective for many years, and now I'm on the board. And I teach in the Race and Resistance Studies Department at San Francisco State University. So it doesn't get more woke than that.
Yeah, the whole idea that being woke, i.e. being fucking aware of
Yeah.
injustice
Well, yeah.
is a pejorative term.
The alternative is asleep at the wheel. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But that is
Yes.
what they want, right? That is what
Yeah,
they want.
exactly. That is what they
That
want.
because
So, yeah,
the people saying woke, 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 woke aren't the ones coming up with it. It's the billionaires who want tax
exactly.
cuts. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
interesting because I see some of our overlaps. Definitely, the first Gulf War was where I cut a lot of my organizing teeth in New York
Hmm.
City, around that, and never taught preschool, but I do a lot of work in education with young kids, creating media for education, and both those
Nice.
things.
Nice.
Yeah, so I think I'm beyond the obvious political things, feeling a lot of simpatico vibrations.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think that that as you said, the linkage between resource extraction and all of these. I mean, to me, as I've come to see it, is we talk about capitalism creates bubbles and markets create bubbles, and really it feels to me we're at the bursting of the bubble that started with the age of colonialism, right? That entire
Yeah.
process of
Yeah.
the extractive model had two outcomes, which is either its overthrow or what we're seeing now, which is complete collapse, and not
Yeah.
systems within systems, but the overall system now, which is something that I think
Exactly.
even the previous generations of Marxists and others couldn't quite fathom at that point,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the system could grow so large that it could actually threaten the ability of the entire living system to support life.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's I refer to it as the Lorax principle. People think the Lorax is like a children's book about saving the trees, but it's actually more fundamentally about finite systems and the nested nature of systems. All economies have an ecological basis.
Mhm.
And if you erode the ecological basis faster than it can regenerate, your economy will collapse.
Yeah.
So if your economy is based on selling the needs and you chop down the truffula trees faster than they can grow back, your economy will collapse. And you might be able to insulate yourself for a little while the brown barbaloots flee and the swoomy swans get crummies in their tummies. But in the end, your economy will collapse. And the only way out of that is either to remake the nature of your economy so you're not chopping down the trees faster than they can grow back, or you find new frontiers of extractivism. And it is the demand for endless new frontiers of extractivism that is colonialism, imperialism, and ultimately biospheric collapse if we don't change the nature of economy. And, the economy will collapse long before the biosphere does. The question is whether or not that collapse is just and equitable and transitioned into something where human communities are in right relationship with each other and the rest of the living world, right? That's really the question. So, yeah, it's funny because I always, it's everything you need to understand about the nature of, nested systems you can get from a children's book from 1971.
I'm hoping, as I was when you first brought that up, that whether it's what you just did there, or if you prefer it another time, that we can animate that as
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I think that's what you point out with that is really the core understanding, right?
yeah,
Everything else
yeah.
flows from
That's the
that.
thing. That's my
That
thing.
really
It's
is the thing.
and it gets to the question about nature, right? Like the only way we only can experience the world and our relationships within it through the economies that we're nested in.
Mm.
So like the greater our relationship to the broader ecosystems upon which we interdepend is mediated by our relationship to the economy. So we can only ever experience the world through the economic relationships we're in, and
Right.
unjust economic relationships will create unjust relationships with the living world. And that's that's an important principle. I tell my students there's no such thing as a natural disaster.
Yeah.
Because it's not that the earthquake discriminates or the superstorm discriminates, it's that the economy discriminates, and the earthquake will travel the well-worn grooves of the economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can only experience it through the economy you're in.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Where housing is located, the quality of that housing,
yeah,
the resource, everything
absolutely. And
that flows from that. Yeah.
exactly. We just watched this play out last year, right? 5.0 earthquake in California is going to rattle our dishes and wake us up in the middle of the night, maybe crack a few things or break a few things. A 5.0 earthquake in 5.0 aftershock of an earthquake in Afghanistan can rubble a village.
Yeah.
And it's not about the earthquake.
Right.
That is about the very nature of colonialism, imperialism, and economic extractivism.
Yeah. And those are the core questions that we're going to be dealing with, particularly as the ecological crisis accelerates,
Right.
because
Yes,
the stakes go
absolutely.
up higher and higher and higher. And actually, then I'm going to reverse a little of the thing, because I think that is one of the reasons. Before we get into ecofascism and some of the details on that, I think that's a good jumping off point for the relationship in general between what's going on with ecological collapse and the ecological crisis and the move towards fascist and authoritarian movements globally, right? Because I feel like fascism and capitalism has definitely always been interlinked. It's kind of the most extreme form of capitalism, when things really aren't working for the capitalists and they really need to reset things. But when you look at what's going on globally now, so I'd love to hear you talk about that. So rather than me start spewing my ideas about that very link, about how this crisis is driving some of those tendencies globally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a number of ways that I would, that we can interrogate the question of the relationship between ecological erosion and the rise of fascism and fascist tendencies.
Yeah.
And I kind of draw a distinction there only because, to be slightly more precise, right? There's like fascist authoritarian regimes. There's there's now very, very much corporate authoritarian regimes in which we have, as the neoliberal project is wont to do, shrunk government to this so small that we can drown it in a bathtub, as Grover Norquist had promised. And so now corporations can rule directly, and they no longer need the pretense of the state or the social contract to justify their behavior. So there's the sort of direct authoritarianism that is a way of shoring up economic interests, and then there's the fascist tendencies, in which the fascist ideologies or logics make their way into other social movements as quick answers to complex problems. So it's really, there's been a long history in the American environmental movement, from its origins in conservation and preservation, around the preservation of the frontier, the wilderness for the enjoyment of the urban white man, and that endless frontier that needs to be protected and preserved from indigenous peoples, from everybody who's not those who it's privileged for. And this idea of immigration is degrading the land, and all of these things become or the way in which the population story is a story of numbers and not a story of right relationship to the living systems upon which we depend. Like, there's all these ways in which those tendencies have infected or found their way into the American environmental movement. And then there's that. Then there's the direct, authoritarian power to maintain extractivism at its when it's under threat. And again, you need violence to acquire new frontiers, and you need violence to maintain the enclosure. All enclosures are ultimately maintained through violence. If you don't have systematic and well-organized violence, you can't enforce your private property.
Right. Can you define enclosure just for folks who don't?
Sure. Yeah. Enclosure is the privatization of land and resources that were once part of customary use by a community of people, what we call the commons. Yeah. And all enclosures are based on entitlement, literally meaning the king or queen took out their sword and gave you a title. And that title allowed you to put a hedge around the commons or a fence around the commons, and suddenly it was private property, even though the peasants were grazing on it long before you ever showed up. Right.
Or
so
it could have also
literally
been on another continent where
or
no
another continent. Exactly.
Foot. Yeah.
We can go on and on, whether it's the Doctrine of Discovery or Manifest Destiny or Terra Nullius. Like, these are all fictitious legal frameworks. They are title. Even when you buy a house, they call it the title. That goes all the way back to being given a title.
Huh.
And so this notion of, arbitrary, unjust authority giving people the power to privatize that which was once customarily used by many is what we mean by enclosure. It's the term for privatization. Yeah. And the power of enclosure, just to be very, very clear, is not the ability to say it's all mine and to keep people out. The true power of enclosure is to control the terms and conditions by which people get access to that which is now enclosed. Right? Right. It isn't just about keeping people out. It's about being able to determine the terms and conditions by which people get access to land, to housing. It's not about saying you can't get housing. It's about setting the terms and conditions by which you get the keys and the lease. And then once you're inside that enclosure, you are being extracted from, like everything else inside the enclosure.
Right. And that's why there's been a push to continue to increase what is enclosed. Water is being a core example of the ability.
Water is a great example.
Yeah. And I would say modern capital and even access to data and information in the age of the internet. What does it mean? Who has the access? Who gets to control? Who can even access the internet at what speeds? It's every component of our lives.
Absolutely. And who gets to define the terms of the boundaries of the enclosure? So there are intellectual enclosures, political enclosures. There are enclosures of identity. What is gender? What is the imposition of the gender binary if not an enclosure of identity? What are racial categories? They're enclosures of identity. You take all the languages and all the cultures and all the ways of knowing and all the ways of being and all the life ways of all the people of all of Africa, and we call it Black. That does not describe diversity. That is an enclosure of diversity.
I've never thought of it quite like that. That's brilliant.
So the racial categories are imposed upon us by colonial imperial powers for the purpose of making us easier to control.
Yeah, I mean, and the original racial definitions was to be able to justify slavery. So it was quite literally the theft of people's own bodies. Right.
The ultimate and most profound and violent, sadistic enclosure of all.
Yeah. So then let's maybe move it on to some of these questions.
Sorry, I went a little off the rails there. Sorry.
I take me with you off the rails anytime you want. That's where some of the most fruitful conversation takes place.
I'm going to make your editing job a nightmare, though.
Oh no, we'll just let it rip. We'll take out the more nonsensical things I say. Usually, that's Sam's job. So if we look at then some of these, let's dive into some of these questions of the relationship with fascism and the emergence of it. So there's different strands that we've started to lay out. One of the things we were originally going to talk about was eco-fascism, and I think that to me there's a couple of ways of looking at that. There's kind of the very historically bound within the fascist movement, including the Nazi movement, some of what you were talking about, the romanticization of the wilderness as untouched, which really means eliminating everyone but the white owners of that property, right? That's what untouched wilderness is, because I mean the Americans were hardly untouched. It's just that they wanted to remove the touch of anyone. So why don't we start with a little bit on that? But then I think that there's ways that informs what's going on more than maybe a strict eco-fascism. But why don't we start and talk a little bit about eco-fascism, and then we can kind of jump off.
So just getting back to sorry, before I got off the rails, so there is this long history of exclusion, control, the privileging of personhood for a narrow population of people that has been part of in certain kinds of environmental ethics within fascist movements. And that is part of the way you justify exclusion and you make some people disposable and all of these questions of preservation. Some of those tendencies have persisted in the environmental movement around things like, for example, misunderstanding population is just a really big number as opposed to population dynamics, which is how people can or cannot live in right relationship in their places and homelands, right? A very small population over consuming is a population out of balance, right? A very large population under consuming is a population out of balance. Population should be thought of in terms of dynamics, but instead, very much large sections of the mainstream environmental movement, particularly the white environmental movement, have appealed to the idea that the population is just too big. These are all ways of stepping away from actually interrogating the more underlying relationships of power that got us into this situation in the first place. So there's that aspect of like the way fascism has always had this kind of romanticization of the untouched wilderness as a way of invisibilizing other people and justifying their exclusion. But there's another kind of rise of eco-fascism, which is in some ways more, I'll put in the psychological realm in some ways, which is the way in which anxiety about instability, about crisis, about the ways in which we talk about the scale of the crisis of climate or ecology, the intuitive understanding that the vast majority of people have that if it's actually true that the nature of the economy is destroying the planet, then the nature of the economy will have to change or it will go away. Like that's a really important understanding that is, if you haven't ever put it in those words, the moment you hear it, it makes perfect sense to you. And so people are being filled with fear and anxiety, and fascists are able to seize upon that fear and anxiety with the promise of stability and certainty through authoritarianism, through control. And we have all kinds of, narratives to justify that with huge amounts of cognitive dissonance built within them, right? The Trump moment is a really good one, or we can go on and on down the list, or Bolsonaro or Duterte, or we can go on and on down the list, Orban, where we're flipping the words around. We're calling it democracy. We're talking about defending freedom, all of these things, but all of the policies, all of the practice, all of the direction is towards greater authoritarianism, the erosion of rights of people, and greater inequality. None of which is actually going to help us deal with the instability that the crisis is creating. But there is a very rare fear about that instability, and so those answers can find safe harbor among a population that's scared, at least some aspect of the population that's scared. And I think that really gets to some of the more populist eco-fascism that we're seeing, in which once people have embraced this idea that we need, that the environmental narrative fits into this story of needing greater control, and that's sort of Fortress America, anxiety about migration,
And I think that's one of the reasons we've really wanted to kind of start diving into this at Undeniable, is I think that partly because the level of political understanding in the United States has always been quite low by design, right? I mean, that's no accident.
Yeah.
And whatever level there is, that's why they've eliminated civics classes and everything to even get the basic understanding. And I see that in the climate and the environmental movement, which is, there's like, oil is bad, oil companies bad, and often the analysis sort of ends there. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems with that, besides I think the inability to come up with really effective action based on that, is that it does leave people open to kind of nefarious actors. And I think we've seen a really strong example of that over recent years, which has been the far right's very active and intentional targeting of wellness community, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Using anti-vax sentiment to pull people over into far right politics. And it
absolutely.
was because, again, there was this general suspicion without a scientific basis, right?
Yeah,
General suspicion of big medicine, big pharma, all of these institutions, but without an actual scientific or political analysis. And then that
yeah,
kind of conspiracism led just a river of people, frankly, from the
yeah,
wellness over into far right politics.
yeah,
The same thing's been done with QAnon and other areas, but I think the wellness one's really interesting because I think it's really a pretty close corollary to many people who are concerned about the environment, right?
yeah,
That
yeah,
that that
absolutely.
it's like, oh, something's wrong, something's out of balance, and if you don't have an analysis, suddenly the argument that humans are the virus, which is what people were saying, during
Yeah,
COVID when things went
exactly.
down. Humans are the virus, or we need to restrict immigration, so that we can keep ourselves pristine. All of these things. Who is it that gets to? I feel like that's one of the areas where I feel like there's a real danger that as crisis goes forward without a political understanding, people are actually ripe. And the people on the right are already skilled at picking issues like this and peeling
Yeah,
people away to the
absolutely.
right.
They're both skilled at it, but also people in the West, in particular, in the United States and Canada and other Western countries in particular, are more susceptible to it because we are indoctrinated with radical individualism that makes us think that our health is about our own personal behavior and all of these things that, again, going back to what we were talking about before, so deeply tied into historic fascist movements going, including the Nazis, including Hindu fundamentalists, Hindu fascists, including Zionists, the whole notion of the idea that the pure body, the body is a temple, the perfect body, all of this stuff has been part of these movements for a long time. The physical regimens, the training, the discipline, all that stuff rooted in a sort of outdoor ethic, all that kind of stuff, right? But I do, and Naomi Klein writes about this extremely well in her new book Doppelganger, which I think is really useful in that regard, particularly around this relationship between wellness and fascism. And she really takes it on very well. But I think that's very much this idea that people have a legitimate reason to be skeptical. Like one of the things I always say is like, I don't have concerns with the science of vaccination. I don't trust the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
That's a legitimate position to be in.
Yes.
That doesn't mean like it doesn't mean that we're just going to let millions of people die because we're not prepared to actually view, like, one of the reveals of the pandemic, which we should have already known, but health is a common pool resource. Our health and well-being is dependent upon the health and well-being of other people.
Yeah.
And so we have to address health and well-being as a common pool resource.
Yeah.
And we would have saved a lot more lives if our only way of dealing with it wasn't privatized.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean we're not going to deal with it because we're navigating the contradictions that we're in. And right. You don't get to suddenly pick and decide when you're going to be a purist about that because it serves your personal interests, when it's like we're all driving around in our cars, but suddenly we're not going to take the vaccine, even though that means large numbers of people are going to be exposed to a virus that can kill them. Like, right. That doesn't make sense to me. Yeah.
And again, it was a very intentional. I mean, that's the frustrating thing about it. It was grabbed as a issue in order to peel people away to the far right. It's basically billionaires who are already ready to let it rip and let people die, saying, I can get bigger. If I can convince enough people of this that they come over to the right, I can get bigger tax breaks and less regulations. I mean, and that's the transparency of that is what's frustrating about the susceptibility, as you say, because it just seems so obvious the con seems so obvious. But that's only when you're outside the con. If you're inside the con or the cult, it's very hard.
Exactly. It's very hard. And it's the thing of like, and I often find this, it's like you talk to folks, talk to folks on the opposite end of a quote unquote ideological spectrum. And it's like a lot of the 90% of their critique of the problem is accurate. And then it's like, but yes, corporations are too big. Yes, they are controlling your life. Yes, they are. You have crappy healthcare, and you have crappy grocery stores, and you have crappy food system. All of it's true, and no, it's not because of blacks and Jews. Yes, that is not the problem here, right? Like what so the hell? Then, yeah. You're so close, but no, sorry. You just missed the mark, and that's the thing is like the right has been very, very good at, and that's part of the populism. The right-wing populism is they're speaking to the actual real concerns that people have.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're not speaking to it explicitly. They're speaking to the anxiety that is held, and they're giving the anxiety of a different explanation, like people legitimately have anxiety about instability and about uncertainty. I don't think that's an illegitimate feeling to have.
Yeah.
The question is the cause of that instability and uncertainty isn't what you think it is,
Well, and the problem is that the opposition as such is explicitly unable and unwilling to also point to the root causes of extractivism, because liberalism is based on the exact same model of extractivism and all the same problems.
Yeah.
And it's a more rational, that's really what I see is liberalism is the rationalist way of running a terminal system. And then fascism is the irrationalist way of, and so there's a difference. Like if you're telling everyone to shoot bleach into their veins and not mask during a pandemic and don't take a vaccine, that's more problematic than running a for-profit system that tries to get vaccines out and tells people to mask until you decide that to no longer doing it. But they're both failing, right?
Both failing. They're both committed to endless extractivism, which requires them both to be committed to militarism and all of it. Yeah,
and that's the challenge, and that's what we haven't built up large enough in this country. Certainly, is the other pole that actually looks at this kind of commonality without. Again, I wouldn't say I think it's specious to be like, well, they're identical, right? Trump and Biden aren't identical. They won't have identical outcomes on anything.
No. Yeah.
But they are tied to the same system. And that's I think sometimes also because of the lack of analysis, some people easily flip from I'm one side or the other, though everything's the same, politics doesn't work, I'm out.
Yeah, I don't think that's accurate.
And that's
I do think
like if you actually can understand what's going on, you can start to say, okay, so what do we do? And for some of those people, it might be nothing to do with any of the parties, and I can respect that. But actually, we can flip to another side of lack of analysis, right?
I would
cynicism, and giving up.
Yeah, and I will say, I agree with that. Now, obviously, both the right, as we understand in the United States now, just for a proxy, we'll say the Republican Party as it is constituted today, and the Democrats representing the liberals as it's constituted today, are both deeply committed to capitalism and to the enclosure of wealth and power by an ever shrinking elite, an ever shrinking number of people in the elite. However, I do think actually that liberals do have an attachment to liberal Western democracy, which the right no longer has.
Yes,
the right has no interest. Right. The right is interested in winning. The right is not interested in winning by actually getting the popular vote or getting any such thing. It's profoundly manipulative. I think it's also true among, it's true among liberals. They're playing that game too, but they actually are, they still hold on to this pretense of the legitimacy of the rule of law.
Yeah.
And of course, for those of us on the left, it's like, the law doesn't define what's right and what's wrong. It defines what's legal and illegal.
and who defines the
Slavery was
laws.
totally legal,
Yeah.
absolutely wrong, and everybody knew it.
Yeah.
Crossing the border to protect your family and to ensure that they can eat is the absolute right thing to do, and despite the fact that there's an arbitrary law that
An arbitrary border and an arbitrary
border and arbitrary law. And by arbitrary, we don't mean random. There are arbiters who impose that will. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so I think that I think that's one of the things, and which is the susceptibility of people who are concerned about the environment and climate to these arguments because they don't have a deeper understanding. And that's part of why I think getting people to understand extractivism and colonialism and capitalism and these systems that are actually terminal rather than the number of people. The other side, which is, Emma Goldman famously said in the 1930s that we were looking at a choice between socialism and barbarism, and she was demonstrably correct, right? and the result ended up being fascism and genocide, world war. I feel like that we are very much in such a moment now, without such an easy, I wouldn't say easy, to call World War II easy is probably not the right terminology, without a clear path through it, which is that the global ecological collapse affects every square inch of earth, every drop of water. I mean, we can see it. There's microplastics in every placenta and every drop of water. Everything we're doing is, and this is the flip side, rather than just people being able to get pulled over to that side, is when does the ruling class in the various parts of the world just take a hard turn and say, if we're going to find new frontiers, it means we need absolute unquestioned control. And and that to me is where the other thing that we were starting to go towards that I'd love to talk about, which is the relationship between where these fascist and authoritarian movements are and how much that danger can grow as the crisis grows. We know that migration and human population movement is a huge driver of these movements. And we're just seeing the beginning of human displacement.
That's right.
Collapse, right? We're at the beginning stages. So what happens when it's much larger, when there's hundreds of millions, when there's billions of people who are being displaced? And how do our political systems deal with that? And is there any patience amongst the holders of capital to even a formal commitment to the rule of law and, the democratic order in the face of that?
I think some of it's hard to know and say, right? Like there in part because there are things that can shift conditions quickly. There are shocks that can fundamentally that create opportunities for mass psychic break, for people to actually shift their orientation, for new possibilities to arise. I don't want to be catastrophist about it, even though I do think, there are aspects of this that are definitely going to get worse before they get better. And we see the ever increasing Fortress America, Fortress Hungary, Fortress Europe, all of this, the way in which, the distinction between climate migration and economic migration, the sort of, it's like, these are totally arbitrary distinctions. What's to say that the people who are leaving because their land was taken over, completely destroyed through industrial agriculture, they were forced into the cities, and then wages suppressed to the point where then they had to leave the city and try and find another place to work, is not a form of ecological migration, right? It is like all living things, when conditions are not conducive to making home in place, will move to where the conditions are more conducive. The monarch butterfly does not fly across the continent because it's pretty or fun. It does it because the conditions are not conducive in the north when it gets cold. And so it makes this great trek to where the conditions are more conducive to making home in place. All living things will do it. It's an earth right. And human migration will follow capital flows, because that is where the conditions are more conducive to making home in place. And it's an earth right. It is, you don't see people migrating from, leaving Honduras to go to Lagos, Nigeria, you don't, it's they're following where the capital flows are.
Yeah. And often where the resource
Yeah,
extraction flows are. Very often you're going to
exactly.
see
Which is where the capital flows are, right?
the capital flows because the capital came from where they were. They just
Exactly.
keep it.
Exactly. Exactly. It's flowing. It's flowing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, and of course, you can see this going back to colonialism and post-colonialism.
Yeah.
What are the largest immigrant populations in the colonial powers? People from the colonies,
right,
who are migrating to where their resources ended up.
Right. That's our wealth. We're just gonna
exactly
hitch a ride and see if we can get some of the scraps.
And capital, and when I say capital, I'm just talking about capital as a degraded form of clean air, healthy soil, fresh water, and our time. That's just been extracted and then represented in chits that can be passed around among the wealthy.
I want to move to, because and I realize how I was framing the growth of fascism could be seen as catastrophism. I think to me it's the stakes, right?
Yeah,
it's if we fail to find a way to be back in balance with Earth systems, if we fail to create economic models that allow for regrowth and restoration of resources for us to live on and for humans to live on, that I think in our failure, we end up in a very, very, very terrifying place that's going to be really ugly. But to me, that's not an inevitable outcome. It's
absolutely not.
It's that's something we had talked about earlier that I'd love to move to, which is that question of catastrophism and resistance. How that just like we were talking about other ways, that the catastrophism itself can lead to an openness to fascism, right?
Absolutely.
When it's like there is no way out of this, right?
Exactly. I think that's right, and I actually very much against the catastrophism. I think we should look at the challenges that we face squarely and not lie to ourselves about it. But that doesn't mean we should. One of the challenges that we have, and this is true broadly within climate movements, including the climate justice movement, is we tend to talk about the impacts and the unfolding and particularly the future impacts of climate disruption as always unfolding only in the context of relationships of power as we understand them now. So we imagine the worst possible sea level rise scenario, not in terms of the amount of sea level rise, but how we as human communities are going to deal with it. It's like there are things about the climate change that we cannot stop and that we cannot, that will happen no matter what we do. We are going to go through a planetary regime change. There are aspects of that we cannot control. However, we absolutely have total control over how we experience it. And every step we make towards greater equity, greater justice, greater deep democracy, every step we take to restore right relationship with each other and the living world in our own communities and across communities through translocal organizing, through interventions of resistance and interventions of resilience, then everything we do towards that end changes how we will experience the unfolding outcomes and will change the very nature of those outcomes or those consequences, right? The fastest path to mitigating the climate crisis is greater equity, justice, and resilience among communities, because that is the low carbon strategy, the low fossil fuel carbon strategy. It's a very high carbon strategy because it requires everyone in terms of carbon-based life forms, and it requires us to be in right relationship with the carbon in the soil but it's a highly carbon intensive strategy. but it doesn't require billions of years of dead biomass.
And I think it's
anyway.
really an inversion. First of all, I want to write that out and make it my morning meditation because I think it's a profoundly hopeful, right? It's profoundly hopeful what you're saying. And I think that's when people talk about the need for hope in the climate movement, sometimes I think people are talking about kind of blind optimism, but that's not what you're talking about. It's profoundly hopeful because actually the path towards justice, equity, all of this really inverts our understanding of what wealth is. We understand wealth within this system as extraction and hoarding and enclosing wealth. But in fact, wealth is the ability to generate the things that people need and want and treasure. And the path that you're talking about means actually unleashing tremendous wealth, right? Tremendous wealth for actual use, not for enclosure and extraction and hoarding.
That's right.
But for actual use.
Right.
And I think it's a profoundly optimistic view because our path to survival as a society, as a species, as many species, is one of justice, right? And that's not a moral. There is a moral basis to that, but really, what you pointing out is the material basis of that. The material basis, which is that the system of extraction and enclosure and hoarding and inequality, is actually destroying the basis of the wealth that humans need to live, right? That's
exactly.
actually the
Absolutely.
thing that's evaporating wealth at an extremely rapid pace. Wealth is being destroyed for generations, infinite forward, right?
Yeah. It's the slogan of the Chipko movement. That Chipko means to embrace. The Chipko movement was indigenous women in northern India who used their bodies to defend their forests from deforestation. In the 1970s, they did it against corporate interests who were coming in to chop down all their, to destroy their forests. Prior to that, it was a movement of Adivasi women in the 1700s who were defending their forests from the Raj chopping them down to run kilns. Their slogan in the 70s, the slogan of the Chipko movement was "Ecology is permanent economy."
I think I've heard that at some point, but I think that
knowledge, not eco literally means home or household. Ecology, knowledge or study of your relationships of home, is permanent economy, management, stewardship, and care of your relationships of home. And it speaks to this deep wisdom that we all know, that our economies are all nested in ecosystems. All wealth is generated through the work of the living world. All wealth is generated through the work of the living world. You put human labor together with the microbial life in the soil and you get food. Of course, you need sun and water and Earth's metabolisms, but the point is, it's the labor of the living world, whether it's the black bodies that terraform this continent or the microbial life in the soil.
Yeah.
All wealth is generated through the work of the living world. And so we're talking the process of restoration. If you are committed to ecological restoration, the first rule of ecological restoration is the restoration of our own labor back into right relationship with each other in the living world. I am a climate justice organizer and activist, and I support worker-owned cooperatives. I support the Seed Commons, which is a financial cooperative. I do not separate climate justice from prison abolition, because an economy that views humans as disposable is an economy an economy that depends on carceral logics is an economy that will destroy planet Earth. It is, and there is a direct relationship between the carceral logic that legitimates putting humans in cages and the carceral worldview that builds dams on rivers, foreclosing on the salmon's ability to bring marine nutrients up into the riparian ecosystems that feeds all of us where I live, right? Like, you want to live in a world where the Pacific Coast salmon run free, you're going to have to work on getting rid of the prison industrial complex. You want to get rid of the prison industrial complex, you should be working on getting the dams off the Klamath. which of course the largest dam removal in the history of the world is happening right now because of indigenous peoples organizing in solidarity with other members of their community towards the restoration of the Pacific Coast salmon runs and their traditional lifeways. And to do that, you have to approach it with a deep and profound love of home and of place and of people. I highly doubt there's any of the indigenous organizers from any of the tribes up there on the Klamath who worked on this dam removal. If you ask them what they thought about prisons, we're like, oh, I think we need to put more Black people in prison. Nobody is saying that.
Well, because
they are so deeply committed to a much, much deeper politic around the sacredness of our relationships.
Yeah. And it's, the carceral system is very much, again, the myth of we need prisons to keep ourselves safe from crime. It's actually 100% related to the idea of enclosures, about where are the resources, who can do what to what resources, and has nothing to do with keeping us safe, which is why, police don't solve crimes.
Exactly.
Because that's not actually what they're instituted for. And
carceral systems are the forever safe haven for fascism. Because they are predicated on authoritarian practice. And the carceral logic propagates not just through policing in prisons, but throughout every institution. There are 2 institutions in the United States where you have one person in authority overseeing large numbers of individuals at once, where they control when you can go in, when you are indoors and when you are outdoors, where your schedule is controlled by a bell, where the outdoor space is fenced in and called a yard, and where you have limited time to access it, where you have no choice to be in the institution, and if you attempt to leave the institution, you are subject to even greater punishment. And it's prisons and schools. The carceral logic extends far, far beyond policing in prisons. It's an animating logic of a system based on enclosure and disposability.
It puts a whole new, you don't really need a school to prison pipeline if the school is actually doing the same job. I mean, there is a school to prison pipeline as well. But you don't necessarily need that if the school is also doing the work of instituting a carceral logic on the society.
And so, to get back to where we're starting, both around fascism, but also around the ecological crisis, the ecological crisis is not about atmospheric concentrations of CO2. The ecological crisis is about unjust relationships of power. And everything we do to interrupt those unjust relationships of power is improving our capacity to navigate the crisis as it unfolds and to mitigate the crisis from unfolding.
Wrap this up, and if you have time, I do still want to move on to the question of the war in Gaza and Palestine. Do you have time to? Okay, so maybe I may actually do that as a sort of a separate chunk, where we might make the podcast a little bit more on this, and then do a separate piece on that. I'm not sure. But so I'd kind of like to. So maybe we'll edit this. These are the parts that we'll edit out. So maybe kind of, as you were saying, maybe we can kind of. So I'm going to ask a couple questions that might kind of round out this conversation, and then we can kind of pick up that as its own. So I guess I had a question here, but in a lot of ways I think you've already answered it, which is, what are the things that make you most hopeful in seeing a way through this crisis? And I think that you've already pointed to a number of things, like the largest dam removal and as a result of indigenous struggle, which is, I think, globally, without arguing materially, the most effective climate resistance has been by Native and Indigenous peoples. Just with that, I've seen reports that native resistance
Exactly.
in North America have kept, there would have been 25% more carbon.
25% of
Yeah,
Canada.
without
That's
it.
the IEN and oil change report. Yeah.
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 But
There's no question about it. Yeah.
so that's obviously, I think, some of the same things that give us hope, or
Yeah.
the victory, although it's contested now in Ecuador, where there was the first, because of indigenous resistance, the
Yeah.
first actual popular vote to stop drilling on public land.
Yeah.
Right now, they're going to try and
Yeah.
undo it, and resistance never ends. That's how it goes. But is there, so in some ways we've kind of touched on some of these, but what are the things that you think are most hopeful in terms of what's going on
Yeah.
in terms of the resistance and struggle and organizing?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to say I hope you have more time, because I'm gonna preface this by saying that I don't actually peddle in the discourse of hope. I find that the way in which it is largely used is either to thrust upon the next generation responsibility for all the bad shit that we've done and haven't taken responsibility for, and previous generations haven't taken responsibility for. So I don't like the way in which we project onto young people the idea that they're going to take the mantle from all of that. I don't like that. And I don't like the way in which it's sort of and the ways in which it is sometimes used without agency. Instead, I am always looking for the exemplars all around me in all different arenas of everything we know we need to navigate these times and the ecological crisis well. And it is everywhere all the time. One of the challenges with the mainstream climate discourse is that we always talk about it at the planetary scale. We talk about this planetary scale crisis. And the problem with doing that is that the scale of the problem does not dictate the scale of the solutions. If we only ever talk about this as a planetary problem, and we only ever talk about it in terms of atmospheric CO2, or we only talk about how much of the Amazon is can burn before we reach a tipping point, or any of those kinds of things, we evoke in the imagination these massive planetary scale solutions, most of which are deeply problematic. All of which are deeply problematic. Geoengineering, all of these kinds of things. Or we feel like there's nothing we can do about it because it's just too big. The strategic point of intervention in keeping 40% of the Amazon from burning is indigenous peoples in the Amazon having free, prior, and informed consent over anything that's happening in their communities. Because you can talk about the planetary scale tipping point as being some percentage of the entire Amazon burning. But if you're an indigenous community in the Amazon, it's the very first bulldozer to take out the very first tree, to put in the very first road for the very first exploratory oil well that's potentially the end of your way of life.
Yeah.
So the devolution of power and governance and agency down to the level of communities is how we both stop the harms and actually make progress towards building our capacity to be more resilient. And I see that everywhere all the time. And that's what you were mentioning before. Grassroots organizing has kept more industrial carbon out of the atmosphere than any state, federal, or international policy. The only things that come close are market collapses. 2008, 2010, and the pandemic. Those are the only things that come even remotely close to shrinking our emissions compared to what grassroots organizing has done by shutting down coal-fired power plants, by stopping mass waste incinerators, by stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure, and by holding corporations to account. The food sovereignty movement, the energy democracy movement. So when I look around, those are the things that inspire me, because they remind me that we have everything we need to navigate the crisis. What we need to do is find a way of telling that story and scaling it up, not by making things bigger, but by propagating more of it, by aggregating to scale, by building a different kind of power. And that's what inspires me. And then the last thing I'll say about what inspires me is the leadership of young queer folks, mostly folks of color, in across all of our movements, and their queerness not just being about identity, but being about a politic of radical inclusion, of a high tolerance for complexity, of a willingness to see the world as more complex and more entangled than just the way in which we tell these linear, simple stories that lead to linear, simple solutions, which tend to be failures, but instead to actually grapple with complexity in a meaningful way. People whose everyday lives are about navigating the contradictions of transition because they are people in transition in a world that does not support that transition. There is wisdom, knowledge, leadership there that we need to navigate these crises well. And especially someone like me, a middle-aged, cis, hetero man raised in a patriarchal family from a patriarchal culture, like I need the wisdom of those folks are offering to support me in being the person I want to be in this world. And so I'm just every day inspired by my students and inspired by my kids and inspired by the young folks around me who are like, they're not fucking around.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're a hell of a lot smarter than I was at their age. They've had to be. I mean, it's not their.
Yeah.
They're dealing with things. There's a wisdom, as you say there. I agree. I am going to, because I actually prefaced my question of hope by talking about hope being so false. I think I'm going to use your framing of it, which is what is the inspiration, because that's a very different thing. Things that inspire us rather than, there's a lot of false hope. There's a lot of false hope.
Yeah. And we use the word, I don't want to be like mean on the people who are like, like, oh, you're taking away my hope. No, I'm okay. I know that people use it in different ways. People talk about the audacity of hope. I'm like, I kind of have the audacity of certainty. At some point, we're going to all, we're looking around I look around and I see, I actually, the idea that everything we need is here now.
Yeah.
We need to build stronger relationships. We need to stitch it together. We need to build power, and we need to be prepared for moments of ripeness when we can actually engage these mass psychic breaks and implement big shifts, because those moments are happening. Like, there are things that we could achieve during the pandemic that we weren't prepared to hold on to. And that, but now we've learned some things. And next time, if you look at how much better mutual aid and just recovery has gotten, just looking at from Hurricane Katrina to now, like, we are so much better at self-organizing our disaster collectivism and our just recovery work. We are getting better and better at navigating these moments in ways that actually are meeting people's needs and demonstrating our capacity to self-govern and provoking a crisis with existing illegitimate structures of governance and authority.
Well,
like
and that
corporations.
those are already going into crises, and so being able to have and it's the whole thing we said with people don't have a deeper analysis. It's being able to have an answer when those systems fail. Being able to have a concrete answer, a solution to people, and that to me is the thing that most inspires. I will use a little bit of hope there. My greatest hope is that the incredible work that people are doing in the grassroots and solving things, or the incredible work that Native Indigenous people have done for generations, right? And being able to maintain that knowledge of the land means we do have the answer. It's not where is the answer.
No.
We have the answer. And it's not one answer. And that's the other part of not seeing it just as a global thing, is that those answers are different in different ecosystems and different cultural systems and different, all of these things. And that's the other side of not being just global, right? And that's why Native and Indigenous sovereignty is so critical, is because those solutions aren't going to be something I come up with, right? Somebody else, some expert sitting in a tower isn't going to come up with. They come out of the land and that relationship with the land, and
Yeah.
that's the only thing that I think can be generalizable, right? Is that
Yeah.
those solutions will
It's,
have to be local and grow out of local circumstances and local conditions. Yeah.
and there's a lot of lessons there from the food sovereignty movement
Yeah.
and peasant agroecology, and subsistence foodways. This is what feeds the vast majority of people on planet Earth with far less than the majority of the world's agricultural resources.
Yeah.
But it's still the way the vast majority of people get their food needs met.
Yeah.
And it is ecologically resilient, and it is under threat. We have a choice between the peasant food web and the industrial food chain. The two are incompatible. One seeks to destroy the other.
Yeah. And as they say, all the good food came from peasant.
Yeah.
Even all the high cuisine, all of that's peasant food. It's why England has such terrible food, is they wiped out their peasantry with enclosures, right? And then they just have like dreck because there was no peasantry left.
Yeah.
So I mean, so like with everything else, the peasant food web means eating better.
Yeah, absolutely.
It means eating better, not sacrificing.
It's a better quality of life.
Twinkies, sacrificing, high fructose corn syrups, but it actually means eating better, more flavor, more deliciousness, more variety. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up the conversation here. Although I know we're about to go into another conversation, even with this, you are an inspiration to me. I think that your way of not just understanding these things, but your storytelling around these things is really powerful. So I'm hoping to keep on in conversation with you.
Wonderful.
And
that's very nice.
And I hope that I and we can help support the work that you're doing and movement generation, because I think our job, and the job that I've kind of given myself the rest of my life, is how to amplify and help tell these stories, and how to generalize the exemplars of the good work that people are doing, to give more people to understand that it's in our hands and give them that knowledge. So I'm hoping to be able to show up and help amplify that work in different ways going forward, because I've love the conversation. I love the way that you are able to understand things, and I think the work at Movement Generation, all of this is so critical that it's the kinds of conversations that I think need to be amplified and shouted to the skies, so that that's what people are hearing, instead of the kind of the nonsense that fills their ears most of the time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Shall we talk about Palestine?
So let's talk about Palestine. And I do want to follow up, particularly around at some other point, and maybe this can be an email conversation, maybe we can get on a call if you ever have a time, about some of the media work as I see what we're trying to do and how that might relate. So that's for another time, if you have time, because I do think that's the key to the work we're doing is going to be networking and building and amplifying other people's voices. It's not like there's a tiny group of us who have cleverly figured out much of anything, except for that there are people who have the answers in their hands. So I do want to pursue that.
That's great. I'll definitely connect you with, like, for example, just in particular on the relationship between Palestine and climate justice. Hendrik and Dana from MG and a bunch of others have been doing a lot of work on that and trying to get some media out there. Sometimes I feel a little like we always want to make these things like 2 minutes long. And then I feel like we're missing the opportunity to actually put things in the context they should be in. But I also get that, like, that's part of the, that I'm a boomer.
Well,
as my kids say, even though I'm not.
But there's also, people also watch 2-hour YouTube explainers about some genre thing. So I don't have the answer. My instinct is we need a lot of both.
We need a lot of different things. Yeah, exactly.
We need a lot of tapas,
teasers
to get people intrigued, and then we need to figure out the deeper ways to get people in. And I don't know what all that is. If I knew, I'd be doing it all. But I know that it's there. So I'd appreciate any connections on that. And as we go into that, like, if there's something that would be helpful to you on the media side, just, let's start
I'll
getting on.
definitely let you know.
So I think that was a really good, complete conversation. So I do want to kind of treat this as a separate one,
Great.
which is, to, I have mine. Okay. To talk about the linkages between the fight for climate justice, ecological justice, and the fight against extractive models of economies, and the war in, well, we say the war in Gaza, but they're bombing well outside of Gaza. The war in Palestine and Lebanon and everywhere else. Maybe you can talk about some of because I know that you've got roots in that work and have been there. Maybe you want to start with kind of some of your more general sense of that, and then we can start to tie the things together. Because I do think it's important that people in the climate movement, you see some of it, the sense that, look, the climate crisis is too important. Don't be distracted by side issues, right? I would say that's the most concise framing of a not explicitly reactionary response to people understanding that there needs to be solidarity with Palestine. So that's where I'd like to go to, but maybe you can kind of introduce some of your work. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just say briefly just on that, and then I'll start in a more formal way. But in 2014, with the People's Climate March, this was a big debate, because there was a quote unquote Green Zionist Alliance that was going to march in the People's Climate March. And some of us were like, as part of the climate justice movement, we were like, we must absolutely take a position against this and explain why it is incompatible with climate justice to support and continue to perpetuate a settler colonial project that's based on the theft of land and resources and violent extractivism but there were people who also called themselves part of the climate justice movement who were worried that it would be a distraction, or that it would get us stuck in an argument that we didn't want to be in, or all of these different things. And, so it's that is very much a sentiment that's out there. And again, it's easy to imagine the climate crisis as being about atmospheric CO2. And I think Palestine and the climate crisis have something in common in this particular moment, which is how you understand the climate crisis and how you understand Palestine depends on where you start the clock of history. If you start the clock of, I'm going to start with climate. If you start the clock of history on climate with your baseline year being 2005, you're telling one story about what the problem is and one story about what the solutions are. Or you could start the clock of history of the climate crisis with the Industrial Revolution. And then you're telling one story of what the crisis is and what the solutions are. Or you could start the clock of history, or if you don't even go back as far as the Industrial Revolution and start with the Great Acceleration in the 1950s, you don't have to question capitalism, you just have to question a particular kind of capitalism. You can go back to the Industrial Revolution, you still don't have to question capitalism, but you might question particular aspects of industrial production. You could start the clock of history at settler colonialism and imperialism and extractivism, right? So where you start the clock of history determines how you understand both the cause of the crisis and the possible solutions. And this is also true for Palestine. If you start the clock of history on October 7th, which Zionists really want to do, they want to reset the clock of history, it tells one story. If you start the clock of history 17 years ago, when the siege on Gaza and the largest open air prison began, it tells a different story around the clock of history. You can start at 1948, and that tells a different story terms of the clock of history. Or you can start in the late 1800s with British colonial colonization and the beginning of the Palestine Mandate. Or you can go to 1917 and talk about the Balfour Declaration. So where you start, and I would argue you need to start hundreds of years ago at widespread, persistent, generational oppression of Jewish peoples in Europe. And the way in which the persecution of Jewish peoples in Europe created the conditions by which this settler colonial project could be brought into being as the perfect solution for the British desire to control Palestine and the Middle East without actually having to have another settler colonial project like the United States or Canada. Another direct settler colonial project. Instead, we didn't like them in Europe, so we're gonna send them all to Palestine, right? So that's one aspect of this that I think is really important. And where you start the clock of history matters. And I like to start the clock of history at the unjust relationships of power that set the climate crisis in motion and also created the settler colonial projects, including Palestine. So that's one thing. And you can look at the parallels, of course, where the British departure from South Asia and the parting gift of partition. And you can look at the establishment of the nation state of Israel and the parting gift of endless conflict. And so in 48. So that's one aspect of this. But there's a whole other aspect of this if you want to understand the relationship. So if we cannot get to a world of navigating the climate crisis well, so long as that we are continuing to allow and legitimate the logic of unjust and colonial relationships. And of course, I am not suggesting that that Palestine is the only place that that's happening, but it is the symbol and the thing right now of the worst of that in the world today, in many, many ways. Also, I am antagonistic to any form of supremacist nation building, going all the way back to eco-fascism, ethno-nationalism, racial nationalism, religious nationalism. Doesn't matter to me whether it's Hindu fundamentalism in India or Sinhalese Buddhist fundamentalism in Sri Lanka, or white Christian fundamentalism in the United States, or Zionism, or Islamist rule. All of them are illegitimate bases for building national identity and foreclose on the true identity of peoples of place and all the diverse ways in which people do that and make that happen. So another thing I'll say about Palestine is for those of us who care about about climate, what the people of Palestine have been living through, even before October 7th, what the people of Palestine have been living through, and particularly in Gaza, is worse than your worst nightmare of climate catastrophe. Yet, fisher folk in Gaza, without access to any input of new materials or resources, and with Israeli gunships off their coast every single day, are still managing to maintain their traditional lifeways, finding ways to repair their boats and their nets. Even though their water is routinely stolen and degraded, they still are innovating incredibly low water conservation farming. In Gaza, I saw 3D farming of strawberries with very, very little water by Palestinian farmers with the support of the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. In the West Bank, they are saving seeds in this incredible seed library of traditional Palestinian seeds that are under threat by the occupying forces, and then distributing those seeds to farmers, and distributing those seeds to communities who are planting them in rooftop gardens in refugee camps to maintain their traditional food systems and to maintain their seeds. We saw people in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza connecting water infrastructure between villages that are being fragmented by Israeli military roads and by settler colonial settlements. So the strategies of resilience as resistance and the life-saving strategies of Palestinian social movements, building women's cooperatives, all of these things are such an important part of what the climate justice movement needs to learn all across the world.
Yeah, I was going to say, and this is something we talked about earlier, which is the idea of ecological resilience as resistance, and how critical that is. And I think when we talk about, I mean, what I was able to hear about, like the innovations, which is that the technologies and the science and the knowledge and the wisdom that we need, I think it points to how much of those will flow not from laboratories, but from the laboratory of resistance itself.
Absolutely.
Right? This is the cutting edge.
Yeah.
This is the cutting edge of human and broader ecological survival is being forged in the laboratory of resistance.
Absolutely, and we also see this with the olive harvest and the olive plantings and the demolition of olive orchards in Palestine as a routine form of oppression and an attempt to create the conditions by which Palestinians want to leave, which they will not, and they are not going to leave. But the theft of water makes it harder and harder. Yet Palestinian farmers keep innovating new ways of doing low water farming, even with their olives. And I think this is it's a lesson for us. It's a lesson for all of us. And we see this in many other places too, but we're seeing it very, very profoundly in this moment in Palestine. And I think that to me is really, really important. I also want to say another thing about this moment, especially here in the United States. I do believe that there's two movement realities that I feel we're seeing on full display right now. One is decades of grassroots Palestinian social movements engaging with broader global social movements around food sovereignty, around energy democracy, around climate justice, all of these things around, like the Palestinian Environmental NGO Network, which is a member of Friends of the Earth International, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, which is a member of La Via Campesina, right? The Gaza Community Mental Health Program, they're building in Gaza where they provide which is this multi-story amazing building where they provide community services in the context of occupation. They built they have a massive solar array and a room full of batteries so that when the occupying forces routinely cut their power, they can still provide services. So they created their own off-the-grid electrical systems because of the conditions of occupation, teaching us a lesson about the importance of taking critical infrastructure and making it resilient to crisis. So every lesson that I'm advocating for around energy democracy, around all of the different things that I work on, all of it is on full display across Palestine. Um, and so I think that's something that's just very, very important and, again, inspiring. And I think our social movements can learn a lot from that. And it's happening in other places in the world too, from other indigenous peoples. The other factor, just really quick, I want to say about this movement is I do believe that because of other social movement organizing, particularly in the United States, around, for example, Black Lives Matter, the fight against fossil fuel infrastructure, Standing Rock, other moments that have been radicalizing for the broader social justice community, has also pushed many of the organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, to have a more radical position on Palestine than they had 10 or 15 years ago, because young people were getting radicalized in these other spaces and then seeing the intersectionality and applying their politics in this way. And because of that organizing, there has been a really effective decoupling of a loosening of the grip of the narrative that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because Jewish anti-Zionism and Jewish anti-Zionist leadership in this moment has been very, very powerful. And I think, those two force factors are happening at the same time. Palestinian social movements have catalyzed lots of broader social movements, including the climate justice movement and the food sovereignty movement and many others, environmental movements. And there has been this evolution among many progressive Jewish organizers and formations to take a strong anti-Zionist position, which has really disrupted the false conflation of Zionism and Judaism.
And to go back to your earlier point, in response, in terms of the innovation and the leadership, in terms of the kinds of adaptations and resilience that we need to move through to a just transition out of the ecological collapse, I think it's quite arguable then to say, far from Palestine being a distraction for the climate movement, it's providing leadership to the climate movement if the climate movement wakes up and pays attention.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, on a political level, on a level of organizing and resistance, but also on the very material things that we need to adopt, that this is a place where we should be looking for leadership to, not seeing it as a distraction.
Absolutely. And I would also point out that, in terms of extractivist politics, in the middle of bombing and assaulting and the genocidal campaign against Gaza, the state of Israel found the time to open up exploratory leases in the Mediterranean for natural gas.
Where they're actually, where the pier that they're building
exactly.
is also convenient located.
Yeah. So all of these things, it's like pesticides that are banned in Israel are used as weapons of war against Palestinians. Yeah. So we see the same extractivist logics in the state of Israel that we see in all the other colonial projects and all the other extractivist economies, and the victims in this case, are Palestinians and the broader community. And of course, like the billions that the U.S. is spending to arm Israel, and the billions that Israel has spent to arm itself, and the collusion of Google and Amazon with Israel to integrate big tech and AI into their military infrastructure. All of these things are expressions of the true conspiracy And when I say conspiracy, I mean it in the literal sense of to breathe together. These are forces who are all breathing together, conspiring around a shared identity of capitalist accumulation, extractivism, and the oppression of those who stand in their way.
Yeah, and like all the greatest conspiracies, it's in full view.
It's in full view. Exactly.
You don't need to dive down the rabbit hole.
You don't need a rabbit hole to see it. Yeah.
To know which way the wind blows. I don't know. Okay, that's I won't pollute the lyrics. And I think there's also, to me, a specificity when I look at why was having a settled colonial project for the British Empire and then American Empire in Palestine so important. One cannot separate that from the presence of oil in the region and the fact that for the last century, the empire that controlled the oil controls the world.
Yeah.
And that if you had no access to the oil, you lost power. And so that there was a very specific reason, because I think it can also be kind of, it's from the Zionist point of view and its allies, it's certainly shrouded in the moral case of the reaction to the European oppression that you were talking about, and particularly the genocide in Germany, which of course the flip side of that is most Jews fleeing Germany would have preferred to come to my town, New York City.
Yeah.
But the US wouldn't let them in because of racism, right? So that moral shroud is already quite problematic because the reason Palestine was not the destination of choice. It was the racism globally that channeled people there, but also that there was a very specific reason why that project was so valuable is to have a reliable ally, and the intensity of the alliance with Israel for the imperial powers and the willingness to turn blind eyes to everything, I think has everything to do with the need to have a consistent, reliable, relentless military partner in the region as it's needed in order to control the flow of oil. So that to me is a very, 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 very direct connection between questions of climate and extractivism and the project of Israel from its foundation.
Absolutely. And it also speaks to why the Middle East petrostates refuse to do anything besides the most rhetorical statements on Palestine. It's easy to say you support Palestine because that your people support Palestine, but they're not going to do anything about it because they're as much part of the extractivists game as
part of and benefit. We're talking about the ruling classes of it.
Exactly, the ruling class of it. So I think this is the other. This is not unique to that. It's embedded in a larger global tyranny. And it's interesting how there's this way in which Europe gets to absolve itself of generations of persecution of Jewish peoples by not by reparations and making right by their relationships at home, but by expelling them or allowing them to colonize or a subset colonize another part of the world. And this is the same thing with settler colonial projects in other places. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz writes about this. It's like, who are the people who are made the settlers in the Americas? The peasantry who lost everything and who were destroyed by European elites are then given the opportunity to go back to being farmers by colonizing somebody else's land for their interests, right? So it's like it's disposability upon disposability, and like far from far from the lie that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is an important truth, which is I am deeply, I will fight fascism wherever I see it. I will fight anti-Semitism wherever I see it for the same reason I fight Zionism, because and it's the same reason I fight caste, because they are logics that are built on supremacy, superiority, and purity.
Yeah.
And those are no basis for building community and a world in which we actually can care for each other and the more than human world that we all interdepend on. So it's like, I'm not having any of it. I'm not having the Hindu fundamentalists. I'm not having the Islamic caliphates, and I'm not having the Zionists. I'm not having the white Christian nationalists. I'm not having any of the religious nationalism or ethno-nationalism or racial nationalism, because they're all predicated on assumptions that some people matter more than others.
And of course, I came up politically in movements of anti-Zionist Jews, on the left. And so, although I understand and have heard that, it was always kind of a shock, because I lived in New York on the left. So you're surrounded by Jewish comrades everywhere. Historically, you're on their shoulders, you're sitting next to them, you're marching next to them. But of course, there are going to be anti-Zionists who are anti-Semitic. There are going to be any group of anybody who's going to overlap with anything. But my experience of anti-Zionists writ large are people who, Jewish or not, are outraged by anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It's the people who are most consistent. They do say, it's not just, I am not anti-Semitic. Like, when I hear that shit, and I certainly have, my blood boils just the same as it is to any kind of racism. I mean, boils, I start to disassociate. I get so angry, and I have to calm myself down, so I do something rational in response to it. But I'm as furious on a gut, deep level.
Yeah.
And when you hear that, and that's as it should be, right? That is the
absolutely
basis.
Well, that's the thing. When
and
the Proud Boys,
the thread of it. That's the thread of anti-Zionism, when it really ties up into that, is that it does start looking at the system, right? And that's the thread of it. That's the thread.
When the Proud Boys came to Oakland and Berkeley, we organized and we resisted, and we said, not in our community. No, you don't get to show up and hate on our neighbors and us, and that's our the politic is actually quite consistent here,
it's quite consistent.
And so,
and I think
go ahead.
And I was going to say, I think, just kind of connecting this and our earlier conversation, I think that in addition to understanding that Palestine and Palestinians are really leading in many ways, both in terms of struggle against colonialism, but also in terms of resilience and technologies and methods and approaches, it's also that the reason this is not a distraction beyond the moral, beyond even that leadership, is that all of the questions that we've talked about, the inability to actually resolve the climate and the ecological crisis, unless we understand their roots in the colonial projects, in the extractivist models. That means that not only is it not a distraction, not only are we actually being led by Palestinians right now, but we will fail in resolving the climate crisis, in resolving the ecological crisis, if we do not link together these systems. It's not a matter of being woke because it's a position. It's that we simply won't have the tools, we won't have the wisdom, we won't have the understanding. And that's tied to the fact that those wisdoms and those understandings are again and again and again to be found in indigenous peoples and in their resistance to the colonization. So to me, Palestine starts to become central question for the climate movement globally. It becomes central farther than a distraction. It actually becomes a central question for the movement to take on.
Absolutely. And that this is an important thing about climate justice is many people think climate justice or in the mainstream of the climate movement talk about climate justice as this idea of a win-win, this idea that we can address issues of climate and also win on things like jobs or on some social justice concerns. Like, it's the idea of viewing it as a win-win. And I would argue that it's not a win-win. It's the only way to win. it is
It's not a tactical.
it is in the inequality and injustice that we screw up the rest of the living world as well. And so that's the take home lesson here. And as we always say, communities on the front lines, they're not just on the front lines of the crisis, they're on the forefront of the solutions. And nothing is more, nothing was more clear to me about that than what I experienced in Palestine, in both the West Bank and in Gaza. And again, this gets, the like existence is resistance is not a slogan. It's a strategy. It's a strategy. Living your daily life and refusing to concede the right to live your life and to be in your community and to remain and to grow food and to herd your sheep and to harvest your olives and to fish your seas, refusing to give that up under the most harsh and oppressive conditions is the strategy. And it is, and as horrific as everything we are seeing is, it is in fact a strategy that's winning.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you for taking the time for what I think is a really vital conversation, and one that I think we're actually going to try and pull together first because of the timeliness and some of our own process of having to deal with this internally and get to the point where we can come out strongly and do this. So this has been really welcome, and just such a delight to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me go on for so long.